we said, we started the morning with an interesting walking tour for those that were able to make it, so you could really see the potential of where you start, where buildings start, and why this part of Manhattan is so critically important. And I've got to say, just, I don't know how many others experienced this when we stood in Brookfield and then looked through the related site to the river. You really, aren't you overwhelmed by the size of it? What was it, where, someone from Brookfield can confirm for me. You're 7 million square feet. Related is 17 million, right? Who else is taking notes on those numbers? So 24 million square feet. And the Brookfield building, one of 8 in Manhattan, one in New York, one in 8 in New York with 100,000 square foot floor plates. It's just extraordinary. It's an extraordinary space. So and of course the other thing that we're interested in is that this is an interesting adaptive reuse of a building plus incrementally adding on. So we're going to start by having a really interesting sort of tour of, I'm talking about a sort of mental tour of the evolution of the West Side. And why is this such an important time? Why is it a moment in time here in this part of the city? And what can we learn from that? And what's the context in which we would talk about creative placemaking? And why are we suggesting that this is such a pivotal investment? Now, tell me that the tech is working and that we're not going to give anybody else an epileptic seizure as we keep changing the images. Stacy, are we all good? Good. Glad we got it fixed. Okay. So, could I ask to be joined? Dennis, can you come on back up? And Timur and Lynne, if you could all come up and we'll take our seats here. And then they've each got some slides. They're going to tell you the story. And then we're going to have a bit of a conversation and we'll come out to you and have some opportunity to have some engagement back and forth about what you're observing as well. As we start to think about why we're starting in the West Side and how does that give us a kind of understanding of a neighborhood in transition. So Lynne, you're going to come first. Are you going to do it from there or are you going to do it from here? Where do you want to be?
Well, I think it would be a lot easier since I have to carry this up.
Okay.
That's fine. Great. Good morning. Good afternoon. My job this afternoon, it's already afternoon, is simply to lay out the context in which this incredible dynamic is happening on the West Side. And Dennis and Timur will, explain the big projects, and then Mary's going to keep us engaged in the conversation. The burst of activity, let's see if I got the technology here working. They told me that I just have to press this one button. Okay. This is the skyline. I can't remember what date this was, but the burst of activity that appears to have happened overnight. I hadn't walked west of 8th Avenue in a year or so, and I just sort of thought I was going to get hit by something because I kept looking up at all the change. It appears to have happened all at once, but in fact, it's building on past decades of public and private action, incremental action, but in retrospect, very much building blocks for the transformation of this big expanse that goes what I consider south to north. I find it useful to think about this transformation as a march up the West Side and its waterfront. In the past 3 decades, the projects noted below and others have reshaped the city in rather dramatic ways. So many of them represent a conversion of use. Should not surprise us because waterfront activity, as historically defined by industrial activity, has disappeared in cities all over the globe and gone to other places. And now the transformation is about converting it to residential and recreation. And this is a conversion that's going to continue to go on for some time. The projects that I've listed on this bullet list build out of Battery Park City, Chelsea Piers. Chelsea Piers was very early to this game. The redevelopment of Times Square, 42nd Street had always been a bottleneck to the further movement of the office sector west. Residential development on 42nd Street, Silverstein's first buildings were very much pioneering. The High Line, of course, changed everything. And then the neighborhood transformations kept coming, as well as now we have the extension of the 7. The Far West Side, as I like to call it, has been a candidate for large-scale planning for decades. Okay, if you look at the images to the side of the aerial of the area, what do you see there? You see RPA's conceptual plan for West Midtown. That was 1969. You see the brochure cover for the Cameroonier Yards master plan that was sponsored by the MTA in 1988. Then you see the image of Senator Schumer's Group of 35 report, which came out in June '01. And then you see the image of the city's rezoning of the 59 block area, of which Hudson Yards is a part. So, I mean, this has been going on for a long time. It's always been seen as, I mean, the city likes to call it the last frontier. I never think anything is the last in New York City. The city has a way of reinventing itself all the time and tearing down and building up. But it is one of the only large-scale areas where transformation can take place in a large-scale format. This whole transformation, happened as a combination of public and private initiatives. The city, people say New York City can't do big projects. Well, I don't believe that's true. We did sort of stumble a bit after Westway, but they did manage to complete 42nd Street redevelopment. And the city has always had big ambitions. It's just hard to get things done here. So on this list of activities, what you see is the city's ambitions at the beginning of the turn of the 21st century. And by and large, most are complete with the exception of Moynihan Station and some others. But, that too we all hope will happen, and I'm as much of an advocate for it as the MAS. If you ask what kind of triggers, I hope this went on. Yeah, development triggers are a combination of public and private. It doesn't happen by any one sector or any one firm. That combination is essential. I think the city provides the regulatory blueprint, a lot of public capital investment. The 7 wouldn't have happened without the city. It was not the MTA's agenda item. The city provides development incentives, but it's really the private sector that puts in place the large-scale projects, takes the risk of building them, sometimes way ahead of project demand. I'm going to show these 2 other images, which this is Hudson Yards site plan, which Timur will speak to, and that's why we have it in here, so when he speaks we can keep coming back to it. And the next one is a site plan for Brookfield's project, which Dennis will speak to. I would just close again with this image, because I don't think we're going to see this skyline the same way after those 2 get finished with it. Thank you. You want to come back here? I'm going to give this to you because you're going next, so you want to put your.
Okay.
You want me to put yours on?
No, it doesn't matter. Just so that people have to look out the window.
Okay, I'll get it. You better do it because it has a mind of its own.
Lynne, as you were making your comments, I was sort of struck,
Can you hear? Yeah, I didn't think so either. Let's just see, can we adjust Timur's mic? Of course, we're dealing with
We're going to have to stop construction on the 2 sites while we're.
I'm not sure what it is.
I think it's important to hold up the progress, right, for this for our panel.
Test, is that okay?
Yeah.
That's better.
That's good? Okay.
Better, yeah.
I was just, as Lynne was making her comments, I was thinking, gosh, we lead our careers and we think that we're somehow in charge of the decisions that we make for ourselves. But I was reflecting on the tectonic forces that you were describing, and my first work in the development industry in New York in the 80s was all east. It was 885 3rd Avenue, and then a little bit further south, the federal courthouse at Foley Square, and then a couple of million square feet for Chase Bank at Metrotech in Brooklyn. But sort of east and further east. And the 90s were a different kind of a decade. I wasn't in New York, and not very much development took place. I was in other parts of the world, and then came back in the early part of the new millennium. And it's been all west since then. And it was way west, if you might think of New Jersey as way west. whether they were sort of purpose-built data centers or Goldman Sachs's very tall building on the Hudson River, and then of course in a much more significant way moving that business from the east side of Lower Manhattan to the west side. And in the course of that move, there was a sort of a tense episode when the firm's negotiations with government broke down and we began to look for alternative sites. And this is 2004, and so in canvassing all of Manhattan for alternative major building sites, they were all what I would call the sort of the northern end of the Lower West Side, at least at the time, and looked at all of what you will hear more about today. And every bit of it, you could see those forces at work, and you could see that it was coming to fruition, but you could also project that it was going to be at least a decade. And a decade was too long in that particular context for that business. But here we are, just a little bit more than a decade later, and it's all happening. So I think I just maybe make one comment about Related's work at Hudson Yards and sort of pose the question, is it infill if it's really a consequence of all of these major forces that have been decades at work? Or is it critical mass? And is it creating the center of gravity? And I won't answer the question, but maybe in balance to the argument about the decades of tectonic forces, the critical mass argument is supported by 28 acres, 14 of it open space, 11 million square feet of workplace, 6 million square feet of residential development, over 1 million square feet of retail, hospitality uses, recreational uses, and also very importantly, arts and culture in the specific embodiment of the Culture Shed, a little bit less than 200,000 square feet of arts-focused development. But that's, if that's infill, it's a lot of infill. And I guess I would say that and maybe just in anticipation of maybe some other parts of the conversation, what I find most interesting about what we're doing is the concurrent development of all of those uses with big blocks of workplace and big scale residential, creating the opportunity for a dynamic synergy amongst all of the other pieces and parts that make up city. And all of those pieces and parts together, which make up the kind of place that people who can choose anywhere in the world to work want to work and want to live and want to lead their urban lives.
I think that's interesting because this is, I've been a student of urban development for a long time, and I can't remember a project on
I can't
this.
hear you, actually. There's a little help here on the tech side, so we can all be mic'd all the time, because this gang might chat at any moment. Any topic. So
We're a noisy group.
They're a noisy group, so their mics need to be perpetually on. We promise not to swear. Try again, Lynn.
To your point about critical mass,
Yeah.
I don't think I recall a project, even Canary Wharf, that was this ambitious, do it all at once, to actually create the critical mass, because one of the challenges of large-scale development and transforming districts is to create enough critical mass so you have a place, have something there. And that's what's, both of the projects, and together.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Mine is only the introduction to Dennis's big piece, because together.
A minor, yeah, small scale introduction.
Yeah, it's a really formidable amount of concurrent development.
But you've got a nice little tick into Canary Wharf there, Dennis, so, since you now own it, I think, don't you?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's true.
so-
That's true. Yeah. So yeah, a little bit of a, not to go backwards too much, but a little bit of a history lesson in terms of our side, which talks a little bit about many of the things that Timur sort of landed on, was the history of this site is we actually, Olympia in New York, the developer, for those who don't recall, of Battery Park City from a commercial standpoint, which is one of the last major public-private type ventures of this scale that's happened before in terms of incentives to spur a larger master plan in one form or the other, acquired the site where we're building Manhattan West, or 2/3 of the site, at the end of 1985 from Sears, the department store operator, and it was the start of the vision of Paul Reichman, who at that time was the head Olympia and York, that he had bold ambitions for the 34th Street corridor overall. So, talk a bit about how art sites evolved and how the question Timur and I spoke about 2 weeks ago, just socially, about is it infill today versus pioneering. We were able to ultimately acquire from O&Y the site for $1 million at that point in time. And we own the land under the tracks, interestingly. And what happened is we started picking the file up as the neighborhood was evolving, particularly as we could see the public attention to viewing this as an economic corridor overall. We got into the last run-up of the upcycle, call it 2006, 2007, with a few groups corporate headquarters that were really interested in establishing a new headquarters. It was still the time of the large trading floors and numerous large trading floors and other types of uses. But at that point in time, to be candid, it was a pioneering area. It was we were marketing a very different dynamic, a very different amenity base. The residential had not grown yet up around it, so it was really about the buildings and the real estate themselves. That was what we were selling. That was what was getting people interested or tenants interested. From that standpoint, we all know the Great Recession came about, and we kind of focused our efforts on what are we going to do now. From that standpoint, consolidated the site overall to be able to build a super block scheme as related was getting in their position to secure the MTA site there. And it's a completely different story and dynamic, and formed our thinking as well, as now we had to think much more about a true mixed use. Residential suddenly came on as a component that made a business decision easier, because Timur's firm and Brookfield both made very, very large speculative investments to an extent on building the land, the platform, which ours was $300 million, which pales in comparison to your initial decisions related. That is a major business decision coming out of a recessionary time period, but it was spurred on more and more by the fact that we were just very excited about what was happening in this corridor, and here was the opportunity to be a part of, not necessarily completely forming, but being part of a neighborhood that was really evolving, and an island that has been migrating west. I mean, I think our strong view is the excitement, although there's still some important things going on in the core and the east side. When you really look at a real estate standpoint, from a city standpoint, the west side has created a lot of excitement, and we're, at this point, somewhat beneficiaries of that. But I also don't have a view. We talk a little about infill versus creating the important town center, but I think one thing, the reality is it's not an island anymore by any means. I mean, so all you need to do is look out the window, and it's pretty clear that we're just needed to fill in the rest of the fabric of the neighborhood, and that's what we're trying to do together and spending a lot of time on. And arts and cultural programming is a very important part of the fabric of a neighborhood. So it's our next focus, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, I think that common thread of opportunity created by infrastructure and the long-term forces that Lynne described, the acceleration of those so evident in the High Line and the development of Chelsea in the last decade, balanced by the opportunity of there was nothing there. It was a rail yard or a railway. And so there's a special opportunity, there's a burden created by, you've got to spend billions of dollars to create the land, but there's an opportunity created by the fact that there was nothing there. And you could go very fast if you had the ambition to go fast.
It wasn't a blank slate, but it was a pretty big area.
I was going to say, it wasn't as if there was nothing. I mean, I'm just going to step in, and then we're going to come to the house in a second. This is sort of post-industrial city building, right? So we see it in the waterfront, and we're seeing it in terms of rail yards being repurposed or built over, or abandoned spurs that are now walkways, all that kind of thing. I guess it sort of begs a question which I heard whispered on the walking tour, which is, how do we know that we actually have the demand for all this commercial space? At what point are we going to be overbuilding? We've got tons of it going in Lower Manhattan. We've got all of Hudson Yards. We're upzoning East Midtown. I mean, you're in the business of predicting that. Somebody must have told you you're going to make money over here. So, when
Something so that you have to earn money.
Somebody probably said that's right. Probably said you
We'll
But you know what I'm getting at? At what point do we say enough? I don't know. How do we know when we're going to reach the point? You just talked about a recession in 2007-8. potentially could have another one, but boy, you look out these windows, it doesn't feel like we're in a recession today. So how do we know when we have enough?
I'll take a little bit the sort of developer, but also the occupier's perspective, because I've been both. The stock of workplace in New York is old. The last real wave of development of significance comparable to what's taking place now was in the 80s. And it's incredibly difficult and expensive for occupiers to renovate in place, or why would you choose an outdated product if you could choose one that was brand new?
But then what's
Now-
going to happen to the outdated stuff, Timur? I mean,
Well-
listen, this is MAS, don't forget. I mean,
Yeah.
we're interested in a mix. We're interested in the sort of diversity of building stock and the diversity of opportunity. We want affordable space too. So
Well, there's been very successful recycling and reuse of,
right, like here,
of workplace.
like 250. We're
Or-
really-
All the
that's
park
right.
avenues out.
And-
Sure.
Yeah, and downtown has shown the way in which workplace can be very successfully recycled as residential, or as other kinds of
Right,
workplace.
right.
So I think it's a part of the regeneration process and recycling process. But a big piece of that is the opportunity for big business organizations to move lock, stock, and barrel into purpose-built, high-quality space. And I think, and as I said earlier, I think what's very special about what we're both doing here is the adjacency of big-scale workplace development and
And
the
infrastructure.
development of infrastructure that supports both workplace and residential development. Because with
Right.
that comes all of the other, dynamic uses that make it not a bedroom town or the streets roll up at 5 o'clock, but really part of New York.
24/7. Did you want to
You know, they ask, the question you asked, is there going to be enough demand, is the question many of us asked in the late 80s, early 90s, when all that building started, when Trump's site on Riverside West started to be built, and you just kept, and the city was nowhere near what it is today. The city had not had the influx of young people and baby boomers that it has today. And yet those buildings, somehow they've filled up, and the important thing is that both, these projects over on the west side have residential population. It's built as a mixed use and not just one use versus another.
So you think that's one of the magic
I think
ingredients?
it's a calling card. I think
That it's both.
that it's a draw.
I mean, related to that question. You said that Michael, when he took us on the walking tour, was talking about Time Warner coming into the new space. So that means you're now going to have spaces opening up at Time Warner. So what are you noticing there? Are there smaller businesses growing and coming into that space, or are we getting non-New York businesses taking up the new space? Or?
It's a little bit early days because it's several years away
Right.
before Time Warner moves
Empties
out
out. Yeah.
of Columbus Circle and into 30 Hudson Yards. But it is a spectacular overlooking Columbus Circle and Central Park, big floor plate workplace full of infrastructure invested by Time Warner at the time. I don't think either we or our partners are particularly concerned about our ability to lease that up when the day comes.
So what I would just add to that is New York is, and we are in many different markets around the globe in one form or another. It's an incredibly deep, diverse demand side market. It's proven itself over and over again, and I actually think we've not yet. There's a draw or a hunger for more demand in the creative and tech side that is clearly views that as being in New York because some of the other cities just don't have the depth of talent. The supply side for those of us who study the real estate cycles, we haven't. The rebuild of the Trade Center, unfortunately, the prior stock was destroyed. So for a major city, there's been very, very limited amount of overall inventory added, not enough to keep pace. It's been staggered, I think, in a healthy enough way. But there is going to be, I think, the realities of, as Timur said, some owners in certain quarters are going to have to rethink the way they approach the market and meet the market. There are a number of corridors, and not to pick on one or the other, since we're streaming live, have not really. To me, they look and feel the same way they did in the 80s.
They have not been updated.
They have not been updated. They have not made the investment. So the new users, what we're hearing from a commercial tenant standpoint, is that they are under greater demands for greater efficiency or smaller workplace for their workforce. And Timur, you certainly, when you guys were on the cutting edge of that at Goldman. But what I'm starting to hear increasingly is people do need their personal space, but they like it sometimes outside the building envelope in common areas and they're picking, the leaders of these firms are picking up the phone to myself and some of the other executives and say, what are you doing in your common areas, in your lobby? This is not the way we used to do business. How are you creating those spaces? That can't easily be done on 3rd Avenue, to pick on one of the corridors that hasn't changed since the 80s.
So you're actually saying to actually create the kind of space for this kind of multiple creative activity to take place, you need new buildings? Or you need to retrofit?
Or you need either repurposing of some specific, or what's happening in the new development schemes, whether it's a trade center or the repositioning of Brookfield Place, not to put a plug in it, we just had the advantage of major public areas.
Right.
This is even that supersized.
Yeah.
It is for the users that are out with large requirements. They are very interested in the corridor and the new stock because they can basically, it fits where they're taking their business. And this corridor had the advantage, I would say, that a number of others didn't, like Canary Wharf, we now own it and it changes. It's close to transportation. Yeah. One of the most heavily trafficked transportation hubs in the world is right down the block. So it's not as if that needed to be a certain link. The 7 line certainly helped that equation. But I think there's a lot of the elements, and now we're kind of filling in the fabric and seeing why you can get a modern workplace. And if you're consolidating from 10 different locations, which a lot of these firms, or 5 different locations, here's what we can provide, some of which out of the space that you're candidly paying for. We're providing a certain amenity, and that is just resonating with most of the large tenants. I mean, combined, it's over 4 million square feet have probably been leased just in this corridor, or it's heading in that direction. That's a lot of square footage in a short period of time.
And I think that investment in public space is that much more critical when the public space is sponsoring, is the meeting place for all these different uses. It's different than if it's 100% workplace or if it's 100% residential. But instead, this is really where all of those different pieces of life come together. And so I think the zoning resolution is very smart in requiring 50% open space in our 28 acres. And what we make of those 14 acres will be very important to the quality of life.
Well, I was going to ask that of Lynne, actually, the chicken and egg thing. I mean, you both have talked about how infrastructure investment is so pivotal. I love how, Dennis, you're talking admiringly about Penn Station. We spend our life talking about how terrible Penn Station is now.
Fortunately, I spent a good part of my life commuting in it, so I know how terrible it is.
Yes, indeed. So we're talking aspirationally here about the potential of Penn Station. But I guess I want to ask Lynne, as a student, as a studier of all these things over time, what needs to go first, or what's the sequencing? How about infrastructure investment, and also this idea of public space investment? Where does the impetus have to come from to make sure these things happen?
Well, the prototype of this is Battery Park City, where the city, through the authority, did the infrastructure first. They did the infrastructure first, and then the development came.
Right.
On the second plan, the first plan failed. I think it's very different now, in part because we have demand driving. This is a market for talent, okay? And the companies have to respond to that talent. Therefore, that you have to have these amenities and creative workspaces, to use one overused term, in place, because that's what they want, and the employers want the talent, especially in a city like New York. So I think it's going to happen simultaneously. You can't do it sequentially the way you did it in the past, but then cities were in the same competitive position when Battery Park City was done, when Canary Wharf was done. It's a whole new ballgame. And I would say it's a long game, so I'm not so worried about the demand catching up with the supply. I don't think they're going to be a huge lag. We'll have a cycle. We always have a cyclical downturn. But the game for cities today is a long-term game, and you really have to have those amenities, the culture, infrastructure broadly defined. That doesn't just mean the pipes underground, and it does not just the transportation.
So you're talking about cultural infrastructure.
The schools, it means the public spaces, It means the activities, because people are not spending as much time in their own modes. So infrastructure is it's actually not quite the right word.
But is the market able to actually provide the diversity of housing type, though, that you're expecting? I mean, the workforce is quite diverse, what you're describing. Do we actually, you guys are commercial developers, so you're not doing, you're doing some housing. They're doing some residential.
Yeah, like I think it's interesting because I'm not sure infrastructure is a bad word, because in many respects, everything that we're doing is creating the infrastructure for businesses to be able to compete for talent. And whether it's the residential infrastructure where people will live, where the workplace infrastructure will
Timur, some
work.
people will live, right? Like, what about, that's the dilemma, right?
Well, this is, I think that, I mean, this is one of the most interesting things over the course of the several decades I've been in and out of New York, is that housing is much more level, certainly from the center as you move out than it was before. I mean, Battery Park used to trade at a 20% discount to across the street, and that certainly isn't true anymore. And so the challenge of creating diverse housing for diverse workforce is a big one. And our 6 million square feet of residential is a diverse range of product, and some of it is very luxurious, and some of it is affordable, and a big block of it is what we expect to be in the middle range of what people who will be working in the businesses in and around us will require for their junior to mid-level people. That doesn't address the full range of housing requirement for a city like New York, but it has to be diverse in order to match the diversity of the workforce.
And I also think when you talk about the diversity of housing product, you can't just think Manhattan. You have
I agree.
You have to think about all the boroughs, because the boroughs have been critically important to New York City's growth.
And West.
And family
And they will
housing.
continue to be. We have,
It's the Westerner, don't forget, he's talking about the West.
No.
Across the river.
When I came back from Asia to join Goldman Sachs in 2002, 12 people who worked for Goldman Sachs lived in Jersey City. Today, more than 1,000.
Right,
Hoboken's the same.
right.
The demographic shift west is not small, and the housing production west is much greater than the housing production east.
and there's good transportation.
So as we abandon the east, sorry about that if you live over there. Apparently it's over for you. There are microphones somewhere. Are there microphones? Michael's got one. And let's see what other people want to chat about. Here, this gentleman has a point. Somebody does, I don't know. Maybe they were just stretching. I thought someone wanted a microphone. Who wants to ask a question? We'll keep yakking away. You live in the east. Do you want to say anything? Go ahead.
I'll take the first one. I'm actually from Perth, so it's interesting that you mentioned it so much.
Have you been to Brookfield Place, Perth?
I have. I actually work across the road from it, so and it's a great place to eat and drinking on a Friday night. I guess my question is about, it was mentioned before, placemaking and place activation, and it's a real passion of mine, and art's a big part of that. I suppose with placemaking, it's all about creating a community that actually take ownership of the space, and I suppose as a property developer and a property manager, it's interesting how that balance happens, and I'm sort of curious as to how you address that challenge in both of your developments with the open space. How do you create the space and then use that to leverage the creation of place through the community actually taking ownership of it? Yeah, I guess I'm interested on your perspective.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll start with it and then turn it over. I think it's very important to have diversity to your arts and cultural programs to actually have the community embrace it and take it over at parts. I'll just give you an example of one that we recently did called Construction, which is this sort of interesting program that Deborah and her team put together, where it's sculptures made out of cans of food. And what we found, and I think it was important for us to have an energetic environment down at Brookfield Place, is the schools and the community took over our complex for a week. I mean, it was from early morning to afternoon, school children and their parents who took off the afternoon actually walking through, contributing food to the different causes, but also grading and giving awards to the various sculptures. I think that is the kind of, we didn't get one complaint from an executive about the fact that school kids were yelling and screaming and running around at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm just giving you an example. That's the type, now that, do you do that 100% of the time? No, but that's the type of thing I think you just need to think about, because you want to, with the urbanization that is going on, and with, candidly, the people that you want to hire or your tenants want to hire living closer and closer or one subway away, you want them to stay at the complex as long as they want to and feel comfortable. It's not just the old kind of 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 or 8. So it's just the way, it's really the way it's thought through, but we really try to think that through in most of the opportunities we have to really capture or program the public spaces.
Yeah. You know, Olympia New York's Arts and Events program is conceived in the early days of World Financial Center, has really been a benchmark, a kind of landmark program, demonstrating how private interest and public interest can be brought together in publicly accessible, but not necessarily actually public space. Some of it is, some of it isn't. And the programs that related sponsors in this much tighter mix of uses with important but much more, sort of scaled down spaces compared to what we're talking about here at Columbus Circle, for instance, is in many ways inspired by that. I think this is one of the most important things we have to do together, is that when you look at the scale of acres and acres and acres of publicly accessible but not exactly public space, the curation and the sense of ownership and accountability that the private side brings, and at the same time the openness to the influence and the participation of the public side, whether it's through organizations like the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, whose board I chair, which is all about creating event and sponsoring artistic performance in public space, in addition to some of its other work, or Creative Time, or the Public Art Fund, and there are many others. I mean, that if you get the right balance between that sense of private ownership in the value proposition of making it work well, and the openness to public participation, influence, and curation as well, then you can get things that are really pretty spectacular. But it's something we have to work at and really invest in to get right.
I mean, New York has been exemplary in this. I mean, we're the early privately owned public space advocates. We actually have a mechanism for that.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is some of them are great, some of them not so great, because it really depends on the disposition. Not everyone is as an enlightened landowner as you guys might be. Right?
I think, I think history would show that we didn't invent the idea of jazz at Lincoln Center, but we put it in the best possible place. And that's partly why maybe we won the competition. I'm not the historian, but maybe. And there's a reason why Signature Theater is where it is, and there's a reason why the Culture Shed is where it is. I mean, you have to invest in those public or not-for-profit organizations just as much as you need to invest in private.
We have, Mariana, we may be out of time.
No, we got time.
Let's just, and I don't know if Lynne and Timur, completely agree, but my view is that this corridor, for lack of a better term for the time being, really doesn't yet have a full identity as a neighborhood. It is, you have Chelsea, which has moved up, which is incredibly cultural arts. You have Clinton moving down. Right now, and we did a little bit, and this isn't just me waking up in the morning saying, what a smart idea kind of thing. We did talk to people on the street here and there about, in the branding exercise, what do they think about this corridor? Do they have a view of what it's called? Is it Chelsea? This corridor to date is basically dictated in large part to the two large projects that are being undertaken, and those are expanding out. I'm not down, there's other major developers, but we're not part of Penn Station, which lacks a certain identity. That corridor, it's more commercial, right? And we're not part of the North South. I think this is an incredible time through what we've been talking about a lot today to create an identity, a name, whatever it ends up being branded, but people will look to it. It's early days because you can see we haven't yet created the public space to get there, but it's about the idea. It's the ideas like the cultural shed. It's ideas about the plazas that will start to resonate, I think, and
So
really create
it's
the identity.
it's a moment in time. You heard it here. Maybe we can think. We'll decide what the name could be
Yeah.
to name this new neighborhood. Barbie, you have a question.
I want to make a comment on all of your comments, and that is that what you're doing in placemaking and the way the West Side has now become a fabric of the city, of the 21st century part of our city. The rest of our city is very old and obsolete, and I think you need to set that standard, and we as a city need to rethink how we move east. We have Cornell, we have what's happening in Brooklyn and Queens, we have, 55 million square feet of educational medical institutions on the east side, and now it's time to take the lessons we are learning here and move them through the city, where there's another 50 million square feet in development as we speak on our nice East River. So I congratulate you for all that you've done, for opening our eyes, for making place, for making it special. And now we need to take your lessons and continue to push them in every direction.
Okay, thanks for the comment, Bobby. I think at the same time, we also need to be sure that we're sober about what we're doing, because when it's all new and it doesn't have layers of history and patina,
Tricky.
it sometimes isn't quite right, and it takes time. And we're doing a lot new, and it's not tabula rasa. There are uses that have been here, but it's, you know, an open rail yard, it's a pretty tough use.
I mean,
And so I think we got to be careful. And
I would say to both your points before about this question of what's it going to be called, what kind of, I think when it starts to be populated and you start to have activities, it will emerge. People will define what the area should be called and by what they do there. Right now, it's pretty much from a social point of view an experiment, not from a hard bricks and mortar point of
But from
view.
the rest. And we at MAS, I think we have another question down here. We at MAS use the term instead for this very reason about public, private. We're not so sure it matters so much who owns it actually anymore. We're talking about civic. We feel like everybody owns the civic, and that there can be a civic purpose, and that we don't have to maybe, it's hard because some people are uneasy with that, but that you can have a civic commons that could be privately owned, publicly owned, community owned. Yes, out here, another question. Karen, yeah.
Hi,
Speak
Mary.
up and tell us.
Hi, Mary. You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for raising that point. I wanted to pursue that a bit more. You know, this development over the years, one issue that some have taken with it is the fact, as Timur said, that it's publicly accessible but not public in the classic sense. And I think even if we use the word civic, there's still certainly a tension. There are many civic expressions of speech and assembly that could conflict with corporate interests. And you know, I think it might be helpful for us to tackle that head on, what's allowable and what not in this publicly accessible but not public space, which is on the order of the size of Bryant Park, or what would you compare it to? Madison
the space
Square
that's
Park?
going in here. You mean the space that's going to actually
The horizontal park space that is going to be created is whatever. It's the size of a park,
yeah, the
right?
principal plaza, the principal public plaza in the eastern half of the yards is not different in scale from Bryant Park. That's fair.
So if you have a Bryant Park, if we picture Bryant Park being not under really our classic public rules of engagement, but under a corporate security force, what's that going to boil down to in real terms?
There's some great examples already to look to. Rockefeller Center has private streets, privately owned publicly accessible space that is among the most treasured urban spaces anywhere. So I think it's all, it isn't, the formulation isn't right or wrong, it's what we make of the formulation.
Well, we're going to have a session this afternoon that's going to talk a little bit about design, because I think there are ways to design spaces, no matter who owns them, to make, sorry that I have my back to you guys, sorry about that. There are places that you can design that are accessible no matter who owns them, and then there are places you design that aren't accessible.
London is a city with big private estates that feel like pieces of city.
Yeah.
And they're very interesting. There's some really terrific, interesting models there to look at as well.
Dennis, I wonder if you feel like commenting on, you own the site that hosted the largest, most, I would say, one of the most significant acts of general assembly or civic protests that we've seen in New York in the last decade. It was on a privately owned public site. And you weathered that, and I'm sure that was not the easiest thing to navigate corporately.
No.
But do you
it
want
was
to just
not.
talk a little bit about that? Because it's an interesting point, Karen. I mean, Zuccotti Park was where Occupy chose to locate, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one comment, and it was a tough process for us overall, was that it became sort of at some point a view that it actually wasn't a civic initiative. It
Right.
became a cause that actually was disturbing, and that it didn't represent the neighborhood or represent
Right.
certain New Yorkers. We found that as we had to engage in our security force and the police force, that a fair amount of those that occupied Zuccotti Park were not New Yorkers.
Right.
A very large percentage as you went along. So I think I think that was sort of an interest, you know.
But I don't think we're suggesting it. I mean,
Yeah.
Times Square isn't mostly New Yorkers. I don't know if
Yeah.
anyone's been there lately, but it's
Yeah.
but it's public. But you know, it's not as if you banished people immediately.
No,
I mean,
no,
it
we
went on
didn't.
for weeks and weeks
We
and
did not.
weeks,
It was a
and you found a
local hub.
negotiated way.
Yeah.
I always use that as an illustration that we can find ways to make our common
Yeah.
weigh in these things.
And that was a very, you know, it was a very extreme situation, a smaller
was.
park for a cause. I just, the spirit of the places that we're creating, particularly here, is I think some of it is the evolution of these corporate mixed use areas over what they used to be. I look back when we actually studied Brookfield Place and where we should take it in Lower Manhattan, because we talked to the community and we did a lot of focus group work. And what continued to come back was it's a corporate fortress.
Right.
It's not transparent enough. It's not accessible enough. So
Right.
we worked to actually move. The good news here is I think the master plans that we're developing, developers have gotten that message, and it's not being designed or conceived as something that has a corporate security force that's ringing it and it doesn't allow others in. I think there's a recognition that, you know what, for you to have a successful place or commercial complex, you need energy, and you need to be in the fabric of Manhattan or whatever street.
Woven in.
It needs to be woven in, and that may come with bizarre protests at times, or it may come with just the energy that comes
Or all of it.
from those around New York visiting it or from other places.
I think it's also worth remembering that this is a different formulation from the zoning bonus
Right.
pops.
Good point.
These are
Completely.
not zoning bonus open spaces. These are open spaces that are inherent to the underlying zoning of the land.
Well, and also, I mean, it feels to me now, in contemporary ways we look at this, that the open space is completely integrated in the design, whereas sometimes the POPs feels like it's
It was
check.
leftover. It was
Yeah, it's kind of
leftover
like,
in
oh
order to
yeah,
get the
check, yeah,
density.
yeah. I think we've evolved. Are there other questions before we take a break to go to the next section? Yeah.
Could you talk about your company's initiatives outside of New York, whether it's in the U.S. or international? What real estate opportunities you're pursuing?
You've got a bigger
yeah.
story than I have to tell in that regard.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, which we sort of started with early on. I mean, we have really viewed the arts program as a global program overall, and have concentrated that as we've grown out. We were a New York, Toronto-based company for a long period of time. We're at this point in 18 cities around the globe. So we're trying very much to differentiate us by creating unique places outside of just always, you know, owning one standalone building. So these are teams that come together and ideas that are shared. And Deborah is, you know, again, when we talked, I was joking before about Berlin, is we're actually really looking forward. We're in the closing moments of acquiring a complex that has a lot of history in Berlin, Potsdamer Platz. It's been reported. It was a gift by Daimler-Benz to the people of Germany. It's a 3 million square foot mix, about as mixed use as you're going to get. Some of the entertainment components, you know, need to be rethought, or some of the arts program. We're looking forward to actually, you know, the ideas from Berlin feeding to Perth, to New York, and to all those areas. So what we do is it's either through our own initiatives or it's outreach, because we do, as does Related and as does other major companies, control a lot of space in urban cities, and you can either not do anything with it, or you can actually make it additive all around. But we really like the idea of moving ideas around, and some of what was successful And here in New York, we've explored it, but not always. We've been moving around. So I'd say it's in at least 3/4 of our cities. There's a number of cities that we just don't have the public space as an opportunity at this point, like Washington, D.C. Just by example, we haven't been able to capture that space yet to really make that work. But.
And I reference Related because I work for Related, but it should be clear that Hudson Yards is a joint venture development with Oxford Properties, which is the property arm of OMERS, the Canadian pension fund. And Oxford has a global footprint. Related's footprint is mostly development and asset management and property operation in the U.S., though we recently acquired Argent, which is a major developer in the UK, the developers of the King's Cross mixed-use project, which is quite notable. And so we have a footprint in Brazil, a footprint in London, but more concentrated in the U.S. Related proper, Oxford more geographically diverse than we are.
There is a funny little Canadian connection with every panelist here, funnily. Sort of weird. Canada takes Manhattan. Lynn,
My wife's Canadian.
so is yours, and Lynn's husband is. So there you go. So do you want to comment a bit on your exposure to other city examples and how New York sizes up in terms of the question?
I think the interesting aspect of what both of the firms are doing is that they're bringing real mixed-use projects to certainly New York City, but also to the U.S. And the U.S. has been very far behind Europe and Asia on really accepting mixed-use projects, and they have to be of a scale. Our zoning is not geared to mixed-use projects. It's geared to single-use. It's single-use zoning, and as the 100th anniversary of the 1916 zoning resolution comes up, good time to sort of reevaluate what we need for the 21st century.
We're so with you on that at MAS. We talk about it all the time about a zoning regime for the future was look like. All right, I promised this. We're almost out. I promised I would ask this, which is because we should close every MAS panel with a question about this. You're putting all this investment and energy into this part of the city. Can we realize a new Penn Station? It's going to be a shame. Sorry about that, but wouldn't you be sad if we didn't ask? Is it going to be a shame to have all this extraordinary development and investment, and as Michael Kimmelman said, we still empty into a rusty bucket? What do you think? Speaking of mixed use and partnerships.
It's been a long time. I do think it's going to come. I think actually these two projects are really a push.
They might be the incentive.
A push, because we don't have sufficient infrastructure to deal with what we hope to happen on the west side.
I think that's exactly right, and maybe this is representative. There's only one pathway through all of our construction to bring an additional tunnel or two of train capacity into Manhattan. And that pathway is getting built now. We've built the first piece of the box for the trains on the eastern yards, and we're going to build the second piece of the box on the western yards. If it didn't get done now, it would arguably never get done. And so Amtrak got Johnny on the spot, and we're building on their behalf, and things are happening. And I think that's just an example of how what we are jointly doing is going to catalyze more good things to the east of us.
Are you a betting man, Dennis?
So I don't want to end as a cynic. That wouldn't be a good thing. But what I think is, because I don't think there's much to be cynical about in the corridor, is that it has to happen. It has to happen for the long term. I think our kind of early successes, because I think there are successes, are pushing it, unfortunately, down the list. Outside of the tunnel expansion, which I think is just, that's a regional infrastructure. I think the thought of taking a tunnel out and shutting the system down, even our planners can't. But it is a horrible place.
Infrastructure that we have to create.
Is the actual improvement of the experience in Penn Station, and I made the comment before that it's nice that it's close, but it's a horrible experience. I again lost too many years of my life waiting on a train there. It is today with the various demands, we need a champion for it, and we can as private firms we can certainly serve a world when we need somebody to grab it, but it is right now we've almost succeeded in spite of it up to point, and we've got a bit to go. There's a lot of buildings that have to come up, but it has to happen long term. This is Lynn mentioned our projects are multi-cyclical. They're not gonna. It'd be great if we did it all in one cycle.
Right.
I don't think that's realistic.
Takes time.
Right. So.
Well,
Big projects like this have always needed a real advocate, and an advocate that's there year after year after year, and we haven't had one of those.
That's right.
well, I can
Good morning,
assure you,
yourself.
yes, exactly. I can assure you that MAS is that civic agency to do that, and we hope that the governor is sitting at home watching now, and the secretary to the mayor, and that there will be other elected officials who will champion it with us, because we're with you.
We'll get one. One will come.
We'll get
step
one. We'll
up.
get one.
It's gotta happen.
So would you join me in thanking Timur Galen?